Every year on the date of the accident, it runs again as a warning to others, plunging into the gap, shrieking like a lost soul. Percy, what are you talking about? The ghost train. Drivers saw it last night. Oh, it makes my wheels wobble to think of it. Puh, said Thomas. You're just a silly little engine. I'm not scared.
If you're a Thomas fan, you've no doubt come across some cursed Thomas media or straight up Thomas horror in your time. Even if you're not incredibly familiar with the show, you're very likely aware of things like Thomas the Skyrim Dragon or Choo Choo Charlie, a game that draws directly from the popular images of Thomas, the worm caterpillar thing. I will admit going forward that I'm not as well read on the creepy side of the Thomas franchise as some, and to add to that, I'm really not a fan of it either. I feel the same sort of dread over these cursed images of Thomas as when I hear someone say Henry died in the tunnel for the 100th time. But since it is the season, I wanted to look at this creepy side to better understand why Thomas the Tank Engine might be uncanny to some. We can begin our overview by first understanding where the word uncanny comes from, as well as where the uncanny originates. For to understand how Thomas can be uncanny, we must understand what the uncanny is. The word itself comes from the German word das Unheimlich, which directly translates to the unhomely. That is to say, something that looks or moves in a seemingly real way but is still off. Ernst Jentsch, a German psychiatrist, was first to note how the more lifelike and capable a contraption was, the more creepy it seemed. The finer the mechanism and the truer to nature the formal reproduction, the more strongly will the special effect also make its appearance. It fascinates me that things like dolls or androids are notable creepy examples because their purpose is to imitate humans, and yet we still anthropomorphize these things and create these replications. Jentsch went on to say how corpses, skulls, and skeletons also unnerve us because of their latent animacy, and this thinking correlates well with 18th and 19th century stories of ghosts, the undead, vampires, etc. What strikes me about this interpretation of the uncanny is that it has much to do with what we inherently know, which couples nicely to Freud's idea that the uncanny is in reality nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. When we discuss things like anthropomorphism, we are talking about inserting ourselves into inanimate things through fantasy. Thomas is not just familiar to us in that he is an engine, but in his personality and facial features that we can relate to. As for why that can be creepy, it is essential that we look to Masahiro Mori's Uncanny Valley thesis that is all but defined what is a creepy sensation. Mori put forth that there is a fine line where, as something becomes more lifelike, there is a brief but important space where there is all too much realism and not enough familiarity. Mori ponders the function of our ability to impute animacy for the sake of self-preservation. Further, this ability to recognize the living from the dead is a part of our motor cognition, which is not just reserved for the animate, but processing other functions as well. Similar to how when we watch someone eat something gross and we gag or scrunch our face, the disgust we feel being so closely related to empathy suggests that a feeling for the uncanny is a protective reaction and a social skill rather than a neurosis to be overcome. Despite whatever graphs or theories that are out there, what is considered uncanny is indeed a slippery slope on a general basis, which is why this discussion is so interesting for Thomas the Tank Engine, as this franchise is so beloved by its fans who for the most part enjoy the benign, picturesque world, but lives in limbo in the general public's eye, who are informed by meme culture and those who wish to use him as a horror mascot. More on that later. When ruminating over this question, I wondered how to go about answering why we find children's media or the like creepy, and in order to do that, I figured the best way might be to answer another question I had often thought about. Why do we find dolls creepy? As they are symbols of childhood, it should stand to reason that the story of how dolls went from innocent symbols of children to mascots of horror should help us understand how Thomas has succumbed to a similar fate. For this purpose, I want to take time to mention the two papers that were extremely helpful in this research: Exploring the Uncanny Valley to Find the Edge of Play by Scott G. Eberle, and Uncanny Dolls and Bad Children in Contemporary Gothic Narratives by Chifen, as they both do a very thorough deep dive into the history of dolls and their presence in the horror genre. So if you have time, definitely go read them both. Anyways, the first paper traces the idea of creepy dolls all the way back to E.T.A. Hoffmann's short story Die Automata in 1814, where a very lifelike doll unnerves the characters of the story as an image of living death or inanimate life. Hoffmann would later expand on this with more evil, possessed, but not exactly living dolls. A century later, we would be introduced to one of the most famous dolls in history, Raggedy Ann, the doll whose whimsical world never allows her audience to entertain the thought of the uncanny or disturbing. Looking at Thomas's world, however, we see it is more realistic, and like our world, has disturbing things, such as scrap, accidents, crashes, railways shutting down, etc. Further, if we look at one idea floating around nowadays of the circles being more friend-shaped psychology, we could argue the contrast between the friendly and stylized faces with the industrial and detailed models may be disconcerting for some. I think that could be the very root of the uncanny feeling some may find in this show. The innocence of these simple, friendly faces inhabiting a very realistic and in some cases harsh world. This is just a thought, however, as I'm not really sure if this has been certified by real psychologists, but it's still food for thought. Anyways, a few years later in 1924, real-life dolls like the Bilo baby, who became quite popular, were slow to sell because they were possibly too realistic. But interestingly, as the decades went by, dolls were glorified for their realistic features such as needing water, wetting the bed, burping, etc. And lo and behold, there was never an inkling of the uncanny in the advertising or experience. In 1945, however, the British horror film Dead of Night introduced a ventriloquist doll, Hugo, which is surmised to be the first killer doll in cinema. As Eberle says, what has been brought to light is not the evilness of the dolls, creepy as they may look, but more often than not what lurks in the human beings who interact with them. To go back to what I was saying about Thomas's world, what we may find creepy about it is the context we are viewing him in. When he's merrily chuffing down his pasture-like branch line, it would be hard to feel the same as when he is uneasily traversing the scrapyards. Inversely, the horror movie dolls we see nowadays are ones with complete autonomy, not controlled in any way by humans, thus making them scarier because they do not act like they are supposed to. At this point, we can draw our attention to Chifen discussion on Pinocchio, who is the epitome of anthropomorphic dolls, as well as the uncorrupted innocence of childhood. Chifen contrasts Pinocchio's desire to become part of society with more recent films such as The Boy and The Doll Master, both from 2016, whose narratives both reflect that what is truly creepy about them is that both villains refuse to grow up and cling to that childhood, despite it being corrupted. One could make the case that part of the reason dolls make for such scary antagonists, and by extension such creepy objects, is that resistance to the end of childhood, as it comes off as a defiance of expectations and directly plays into Freud and Maury's ideas that those things that don't act like we expect them to make them creepy. This further proves that it isn't the doll itself in this example that makes the scenario creepy, but the unsettling juxtaposition the context provides. This leaves us with inexplicable ties to the concept of anthropomorphism, which comes from our desire to impose identity onto the inanimate. This dichotomy fascinates me, but I think the simple reason we can enjoy anthropomorphism is because when we bestow traits onto inanimate things, we do it with the knowledge that those things do not have any desire to harm us, or because we feel a connection to it in some way. But the fine line can be crossed when something bears too much resemblance to life without our consent, and our imagination is given too much to work with. How I think this works with Thomas is that because the act of anthropomorphism is done for us, then some may be faced with the idea that the inanimate has its own will, and those audience members can be creeped out if they are not on board with the hook. Alternatively, because of the information given to us, our imaginations are left to toil at other details like how they work, which can lead to questions like how they got that way. And so, the Thomas worm is born. Ugh. With all this in mind, creepy things and moreover the horror genre in general is an incredibly large and lucrative one, enjoyed by many people. Popular pieces of fiction like Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin or Carrie by Stephen King, as well as his many other works, had a great influence on the genre because of their use of evil children. Because of the infantile psyche of these children and their lack of social or moral development, they lend themselves to the subversion of expectations that unsettles us. Children's minds are nigh incomprehensible to adults because of this, which includes things like their relationships with dolls. For example, we can see in Forman-Brunell's doll study nurseries as a site for this relationship where children read doll books that can be about dolls, books written by dolls, and doll memoirs. This fantasy reinforced the child-doll relationship that went beyond a simple plaything. This interdependence of the doll and the child is quirky and sometimes worrying to adult eyes, so it understandably finds its distorted and darkened representations in Gothic narratives. The doll becomes a sinister presence that contaminates the hallowed domain of childhood that is believed to be immaculate and immune to evil. This can also be seen in other children's material, where they can develop a very intimate relationship with what they grow up with. In many ways, how children can play with dolls, dressing them up, making their clothes and houses, creating little stories for them, are entirely parallel with how Audrey himself created his own world through model railways, and likewise many fans. It is this relationship with childhood as an adult that can be considered creepy to some, most likely those who have had to conform to society and the values that dictate childhood things as immature. If you want to hear about the meaningful ways fans have taken Thomas into their own hands, I already did a video dedicated to it. But for this video, we shall explore the ways this meaning-making can lend to the uncanny. Considering our subject matter, it is clear there is a major theme of childhood and the past, represented through symbols like dolls, toys, and fairy tales, and them being corrupted to defy our expectations. This brings to mind the Cottingley Fairies incident, where 2 young girls claimed to have taken photos of real fairies. The photos were published in magazines everywhere, and the public was caught in the fairy mania. Scholars said the reason people were so inclined to indulge in this was due to the depression felt after the recent end of World War I. Another famous example that likely comes to mind is Bigfoot, and the infatuation many have found in that venture. Looking at this escapism we find through fiction or what could be, we find that even adults who disregard children's media as simple can't help but get in on this kind of excitement. It is curious then that the narratives we discussed seek to corrupt these childhood symbols or support the notion that creepy people cling to that nostalgia. As we discussed with dolls, the journey from innocent to uncanny seems to be linked with maturity, since society has grown to associate these symbols with pathological symptoms, including transference, escapism, distorted perceptions of reality, fixation on non-living objects, obsessions with the past, and so on. I think the reason Thomas is now so often associated with creepy things like Choo Choo Charlie or something is because we are attached to childhood symbols, and invent new ways to view them that fit individual interests. These creators use Thomas as a symbol of chaos or fear because, like Ira Levin or Stephen King, there is some thrill to be found in flipping the script on these once innocent things. Not every fan of Thomas will be satisfied with the benign world of Sodor, so they will create new fictions that add drama or terror that excites them. And that's alright. While I don't particularly like seeing Thomas distorted or corrupted, I have found some appreciation for the effort and enjoyment those who do have with it. This probably makes this video a little biased, so if you want a good video from someone who does enjoy those things, I would recommend Lias's video, What Thomas Means to the Internet, which I feel strikes a good balance of understanding Thomas, its fans, and how it has become a symbol of horror. Their video didn't inspire this one, but it did help me understand something I find repulsive or unsettling as something still valid as an art form, with its own following or people who enjoy the thrill of the unexpected. While I enjoy the comfort of the warm, friendly nostalgia and the exploration of that world, there are many who enjoy exploring the subversion of that comfort, and inserting more intense themes or elements. As a fan of the Thomas world, I have to appreciate when someone can make their own meanings by using Thomas to explore their interests, even if those interests are not mine. But as with my first video, I will say that as long as there is passion behind these creations, then they will inspire someone else's. And if there's anything I want Thomas to be known for, that would be it.